What kind of future does FinTech have in the European financial sector? Are we experiencing the peak of FinTech mania, or have we only seen the start of what financial innovation and new technology can enable? And as the sector gets bigger, should we start to worry a bit more about the risks that FinTechs can pose to consumers? I'm Scott Martin from Deloitte Centre for Regulatory Strategy, and you're listening to Regulated Radio. I've got Suchitra Nair, our FinTech Director, back with me on the show today to give us her views on this very hot topic. We'll be talking about where FinTechs are going in the UK and Europe this year, what regulators are doing to encourage further innovation, but also get ahead of potential risks, and how well prepared FinTechs are for dealing with more challenging regulation as they scale. All this coming up in the next 20 minutes or less. You might be able to open a bank account on an app in less time, but this is still the shortest podcast on financial policy you'll find anywhere. This is Regulated Radio. If you pull out your phone right now, I'm willing to bet you've lost track of the amount of apps you have to help manage all your day-to-day finances. From app-based current accounts to foreign currency transactions, real-time spending alerts, saving tools, microlending, and investment, the list goes on and on when it comes to the things that we used to do standing in our bank branch or on our bank's website. But now, the world's changed. Most of us have disaggregated the way that we do finance, and the financial sector has been racing to leverage the technology that lets us do it. Now, a few weeks ago, we here at Deloitte were thrilled to be the platinum sponsors of the Innovate Finance Global Summit in London. For those of you that haven't heard of it before, this summit's kind of like the Davos of FinTech. It's a really big annual event that attracts everyone from across the industry and regulators to come talk about the future of finance and technology. Now, we heard a lot of interesting things there, which we're going to talk about on the show today. But for this, I'm really happy to welcome Suchitra Nair back to Regulated Radio. Keen listeners of the podcast will remember that Suchitra is a director in Deloitte Centre for Regulatory Strategy covering FinTech and was a guest on our very first show last year, back when we were just getting started. Suchitra, it's good to have you back on the show.
It's great to be back, Scott.
So, Suchitra, I think it goes without saying that interest in the FinTech sector is growing even faster this year than in previous ones. What are some of the recent trends that have caught your eye that you think really show where the sector is going?
I think the latest industry trend is very much about rolling up your sleeves and experimenting. And we've moved beyond the hype stage, which is brilliant. So it's all about trying lots of proof of concepts, showing it to senior executives, getting their buy-in and getting the funding for it. And a genuine intent to collaborate with the startups. So we're seeing a different level of engagement between fintechs and incumbents. So I think that's really promising, and we're going to see some really good solutions being rolled out at scale. On the regulatory front, another encouraging sign where regulators are moving on from just monitoring and flagging risks to better conversations with firms, going out to industry and really understanding how new technology is being applied to financial services and products, and how to map the old world of regulation to the new, for example, in the crypto asset space. So overall, the industry is maturing in terms of what they're doing with tech innovation, and all parties are kind of moving on in the learning curve, which is a great place to be.
Now, we mentioned the Innovate Finance Global Summit that happened recently. You were there. You represented Deloitte. You chaired a panel on FinTech and regulation even. I'm wondering, what messages from regulators about the FinTech sector did you think were fundamentally new or fundamentally different this year?
I think a number of messages stay the same, but I think, like I said, I think the parties that are coming to the table, whether it's the regulators or the firms, are in a different place in the way they use tech innovation. So it's richer conversations for a start, and that willingness to engage both from the regulators and the incumbents. We also see an uptick in regulatory interest as well. So there is that real, genuine intent to support firms and to understand how policy should change to help firms and the industry develop in this space. But again, very exciting, regulators themselves are exploring how to use new tech for supervision. So we have this term called subtech, and the Bank of England, the PRA, the FCA, they're all getting into the action and really trying out tech innovation in their own space. So I think all that just adds to the momentum in industry and I think will encourage innovation and push push it along in the right direction.
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting things coming out of the IFGS that really struck me were the points Mark Carney made in his keynote speech, where he was talking about how the Bank of England is rebuilding its payments infrastructure to be more open, more accessible to challengers. Let's listen to what he had to say at the summit.
The bank is in the middle of a rebuild of RTGS, that system I just referred to. Now, it's a system that processes over 600 billion pounds of payments every single day. And until recently, only commercial banks had direct access to it. And alternative payment service providers, or PSPs, had to route through those banks. That made sense in an old financial system arranged around a series of hubs and spokes, but it's increasingly anachronistic in a new distributed finance that's emerging. So we're now making it easier for a much broader set of firms to plug in and compete with more traditional providers. Responding to demands of FinTech providers, some of whom I can see, the rebuild of RTGS will provide API access to read and write payments data. And 18 months ago, we became the first G20 central bank to open up access to our payment services to a new generation of non-bank PSPs. Since then, 5 have become full members, and a growing pipeline of around 20 firms are currently exploring how to join.
So, Suchitra, taking that statement at face value, what do you think the financial sector should expect to see from the Bank of England and even from other regulators in the near term?
Yeah, I think I'd put that in 3 buckets. So the first bucket goes back to what Mark Carney said around making the current infrastructure compatible with tech innovation. So sensible support and trying to move with the times. But you're not going to see fundamental shifts in the way they operate in terms of infrastructure. The second bit is around exploration, understanding where the industry is going, having those valuable conversations with innovators, and more focused work around crypto assets, AI, the cloud, and some of the implications on the current policy framework. And that is a big piece because that's where it's going to skill up the regulators in terms of their knowledge and the ability to shape policy. I think the last piece, which is critical to firms and industry, is the fact that whilst regulators are technology neutral, what you can expect from them is that robust challenge around the new and emerging risks that come into play when they experiment with tech innovation. And I think there is an education piece where, just as they will have to with their senior execs, take them along the journey, show them the proof of concepts, demonstrate that they've got a really good handle on those new risks, they have to do the same with the regulators. So I think firms can expect a pretty robust level of challenge coming from a place of tell me what you do and why do you think this is great and where are the risks? And you have to be able to demonstrate that true understanding end to end of putting that tech innovation into your business.
Now, you talked about the maturity of the fintech sector, and one of the things that really strikes me looking at it is that we're really starting to see some fintechs and some neobanks starting to take on quite a significant scale. They're amassing a large base of retail customers, handling an even larger volume of payments and transactions every day. Now, we hear a lot of talk about midlife growing pains, problems you encounter when you're a larger institution that you just didn't when you were smaller. What's the regulator angle on this, in your view?
I mean, the regulator always will take a proportionate view towards supervision. So if you are bigger and you pose greater risks to the financial system or to consumers, unsurprisingly, you will be the subject of more scrutiny. And I think we see examples of some of these challenger firms getting things wrong. So it's pretty well covered in the press. But of course, growing up is hard. And while most firms want to do the right thing, I think it's difficult, but also equally important to maintain that breadth and depth of compliance efforts, especially around things like AML and conduct risk around digital journeys, which we touched on in our recent paper, and of course, regulatory capital and the risks underpinning that. So growing up, I think, is hard, but it also means that more people are looking at you.
Does that bring a certain level of cost that most fintechs are prepared for?
Yes. Well, it does bring more costs, but I don't know about preparedness. It's a good question. I don't think they realize the full scale of what it takes in terms of that depth and breadth of compliance efforts. But they're learning fast, as you'd expect.
Yeah.
But it is a journey, and I think it's a difficult one.
Okay, now thinking about collaboration between fintechs and large financial services incumbents, the big banks, the big insurers of this world, are you seeing much sign of that recently, or do you think there's any regulatory barriers that could be holding back more of those joint ventures, more of that collaboration?
So I'm definitely seeing more collaboration in the market between incumbents and startups or scale-ups. And I think you have to thank the challenger banks for that. So they really set the tone of let's do what we're really, really good at, and then let's bring in components or modules for things that we're not so good at. So the whole buy versus build debate. So, they really focus minds in terms of sticking to the knitting and buy the rest in. As far as I can tell, the barriers are not fully regulatory. But I think it's down to the firms to fully understand what the change in risks are when you start bringing in different components into your business and you don't have full control over that. And so you see that shift in regulatory focus as well in terms of understanding how the outsourcing arrangements work, whether the board really understands where the risks lie when you're dealing with multiple suppliers or multiple third parties. So regulation in itself is not a barrier. But of course, when the scrutiny shifts to newer emerging risks, then of course that's challenging for firms to respond to that.
I wanted to come back on the topic of international regulatory cooperation because I think we're increasingly seeing many fintechs leave their home markets and take on increasingly cross-border business models. Now, this is something that we've been doing a lot of writing on at Deloitte because we're seeing more and more regulatory fragmentation between countries in many financial policy areas like bank capital, capital markets, cyber risk, and others. I want to play a clip from Anna Wallace, who's the head of Innovate at the UK Financial Conduct Authority. She's talking about this issue at the IFGS conference.
Yeah, I think there's two ends of it actually that we work to. One is the industry really do need to. Yes, there's a lot of fragmentation. That's part of innovation. It's not a bad thing, in and of itself. But there needs to be kind of an upskilling and an improvement in standards, and that doesn't purely come from regulation. It has to come from the industry itself and helping itself out on that. And there are some really scary numbers when it comes to things like fraud and scams, in this market, and that does need to be tackled by the industry. I think on a global level, look, by the time we harmonise the standards, none of this stuff will exist in the form that it does at the moment. So that's probably not necessarily a feasible plan, but I know we've spoken about the global sandbox in the conference, and that really is a place where regulators can come together and problem share in quite a practical way. Will it lead to harmonisation the next day? No, it won't, but it will actually allow us to have a kind of common understanding of what the problems are. And we might decide to take a different approach, and frankly, that might be the right thing to do when it comes to the consumer offering. I think when it comes to the capital market side, IOSCO and FSB are going to be important. But what I like about the global sandbox idea is that actually they can feed in the practical element of learning into these standard setters. So it's not just policy made in a vacuum. It's actually based on real business models and real problems that regulators are facing today. So I think there's something we can do more practically as regulators on a global level, but there's definitely something the industry can do as well. And I'll let everyone else tell me what the regulator should be doing.
Now, Suchitra, I think you were chairing that panel when Anna made that statement. She's mentioned global sandboxes as a tool to overcome global regulatory fragmentation. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, I guess, as you say, regulatory fragmentation is a reality. But true global sandboxes, in terms of a firm being able to test cross-border, I think we're a bit far away from that in reality. And the underlying issue, of course, is the fundamental difference in the regulatory frameworks, the objectives of each regulator, and frankly, the skills that you need to support that cross-border testing. So I think the fundamentals are still not there to allow that true global sandbox to be established. But what we have, which is really, really good, is a step towards that. So it's the global network that now the GFIN is, the original kind of sandbox initiative has morphed into this GFIN network. And what it does is it brings regulators who want to play, not everyone's coming to play, who want to play to the table and to share experiences. And I think the important thing with fintech and regulation is everyone is learning on the job. And so it's important to share experiences in terms of how those risks, the new and emerging risks, actually come into the system. So to that extent, I think it's brilliant to get people on the same page. But then how it then translates to policy and harmonized policy across jurisdictions is, I think, something that we'll need to see whether it translates to that. So I think we've got the right first step in that journey, but I think a lot more work needs to be done to bring around harmonization as a next step.
Yeah, so the GFIN, as you've described it, sounds like it's of great benefit to regulators that participate. But what does it practically mean for the fintech firms that are looking to benefit from it?
If you're a UK firm and you want to test in Singapore, what the GFIN network will give you is a right contact at the Monetary Authority of Singapore who is interested in innovation and who's exposed to that world in terms of understanding what the licenses are and supporting you through that process. So essentially, it gives you access to the right networks. It gives you access to the market and allows you to fast track into that market as long as you meet all the regulatory requirements.
So I'm going to ask you about the European Union. People that know me well know that I used to work in Brussels, working in EU policy. I'm really obsessed by this stuff. And of course, 2019 is a really big year for the EU. We just had European Parliament elections. There's going to be a new European Commission later this year. That's going to bring a whole new financial services agenda at the EU level. Do you think we're about to see Europe make a really big push on the competitiveness and the regulation of its fintech sector?
I mean, I definitely see the European Union shifting gears on fintech recently. So I see a concerted effort to consider how fintech can deliver on areas such as the CMU. And interestingly, they're also exploring how to open up banking to non-banks. So that's a significant policy shift. We're waiting to hear more on that. And traditionally, we know that the EU have been doing a lot around blockchain through their observatory and in terms of engaging industry. And they have the AI expert group as well. So they've been ticking along on the more kind of traditional tech innovations areas. But I can see the policy shifts now coming through in some of the other areas, which is brilliant.
Okay, so what's at the top of the agenda for the European Commission as they think of their priorities going forward?
So a couple of areas which we know, so crypto assets, so no surprises there. I think there's definitely a need to drive harmonization and clarity around policy framework. We know they want to do stuff around AI and ethics and be a leader in this space. I think there are many people trying to wear that crown at the moment across the world. We also know that they're looking at opening up banking to non-banks, as I said. Not clear at this point how that will come through in the form of policy, but a very interesting space to watch. And last but not least, they continue their support on the blockchain front through their observatory, through their blockchain first initiatives. So I think those are the broad policy areas where I see more action. But it'll come through in climate risk and CMU as well in some shape or form.
So, teacher, it's a well-worn regulated radio tradition by now that we don't let our guests go without putting them on the spot and asking them to make a prediction about the future. So, this being your turn, what big, new, exciting trend, or alternatively, what big, bad, sobering risk do you think we might see emerging in the fintech space over the next year?
Well, it's a personal prediction, but I'll do it. As someone who lives and breathes regulation on a daily basis, I think the big, new, exciting trend for me is regulators looking to disrupt themselves with tech innovation. I think that, it's really hard to do, but they're really engaging with it. There's momentum there. And I think that learning by doing will raise the general proficiency of policymaking and within the supervision teams. So I think that bodes really well for industry. The sobering thought is that with this big rise in tech innovation and adoption, there will be failures. And the resilience of the system, whether it's at firm level or the regulatory and supervisory level, will be put to the test. And consumer trust will be put to the test. So I think that is essentially the sobering piece. But I think, again, going back to my learning by doing point, as long as everyone works together to fully understand the risks, and be prepared for the unknown unknowns, I think we'll be better prepared to keep that consumer trust, which is at the heart of all this.
All right, so teacher, thanks so much. It's great to have you back on the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
And there it is. Certainly enough on the horizon for fintechs to keep us guessing going forward. From the rise of artificial intelligence and cryptocurrencies to the age-old problem that doing business across borders is actually really hard for both firms and regulators, the revolution of finance by new technologies still has a lot of difficult problems to solve, even as the fintech sector becomes more mature and a more normal part of our lives. Regulators have as many difficult questions to solve as anyone else. They know that encouraging fintech competition and growth gives their countries a competitive edge and can make things better for consumers. But it's also their responsibility to understand and address emerging risks before anyone else. Understanding what regulators do next will be really critical for financial sector firms looking to thrive in this new commercial reality. But that's why we're here. That's why we bring you Regulated Radio, to make sure we're always discussing the hottest issues in the world of financial regulation and policy. If you're interested in reading more about the Innovate Finance Global Summit, you can go to deloitte.co.uk/IFGS. Now remember, if you like the show, hit the subscribe button to ensure you receive notifications about new episodes. And if you're already subscribed, you can give us a review on your platform of choice or email us with your thoughts at regulatedраdio@deloitte.co.uk. We would love to hear from you. And don't forget, if you listen to Regulated Radio and think, that was awesome, then do us a big favor and recommend the show to a friend or a colleague. Let's convince them that podcasts are the future. But that's all for now. Thanks so much for joining us, and you'll hear from us again soon.